Do you identify as a communist?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I don't like, I don't feel like if I just sat and told you all the ideas I am for, you're going to hear a little bit of communism. You're going to hear a little bit of socialism. You're going to hear a little bit of anarchy mostly from the mutualist perspective. I know anarchy is very, I always tell people, look, anarchy is a lot like ice cream. There's so many different flavors. You're going to find some you like and some you don't. But but yeah, like I feel like if I had to just pick one thing, like if I had to just be like, okay, I'll pick one, I feel like market socialist would be like the closest thing. But there's a lot of ideas that I have that are outside of that box too. You know what I mean? Like, does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, I mean, market socialism I have some problems with, but
Well, what are the problems? Let's hear it, because there
well,
might be some things I'm not aware of.
well, I think that like if the goal is right to build people power to leverage us out of the capitalist system that produces fascism and unemployment and housing crises and the end of the environment, etc., then I also think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel in the sense that we can look back at the last 100 years of class struggle and look at what examples kind of worked, why they worked, what the successes were, what some of the limitations were, and just have a real kind of concrete analysis of the positives and the negatives. And in looking back at the last 100 years of class struggle, I think it's pretty clear that hands down, I mean, we could start with the Second World War. Like, who defeated the Nazis? Well, was it the 27 million communists in the Red Army who gave their lives who defeated the Nazis? Yeah, it was. Like, that is very clearly historically proven. And did communists, if it be in the Soviet Union or elsewhere in the world, did they move countries from like semi-feudal, really barren and underdeveloped areas that also had rampant illiteracy, extreme inequality, horrible healthcare, to being really, nations in which you had guaranteed healthcare, housing, a job, education that you didn't have to pay for? And that's not to say that there aren't things where you go through and say, oh, well, there was this problem, or is this problem, or there are other issues, because of course, nothing's perfect, because if it was, sure, then it would be some Garden of Eden or something along those lines. But you look at what's been done in Cuba, you look at what's been done in under Thomas Sankara in the 1980s in kind of West Africa. These are moments where people seized power, transformed society, and put forth an actual model in which people were guaranteed these basic things like healthcare, housing, etc. And they functioned in spite of the fact that there's this great quote by Che that I'll have to reference. Che said that the biggest problems that they had in Cuba, there were two major problems that they had. The first was imperialism, and the second was imperialism. And so they were doing this under the worst possible conditions, because there's never been a socialist experiment in the history of the world that has not had to deal with the imperialist meddling of capitalist countries.
Right.
And you have to have that in mind when you analyze countries like Cuba or China or the Soviet Union or other such places. And it depends on what you mean by market socialism. Sorry, I kind of went off and talked more explicitly about communism and socialism. But with market socialism, were you thinking more of like democratic socialist countries that are still integrated into the market?
Kind of, yes, but going significantly further than that. Like the idea of market socialism as a concept, which gets labeled, sometimes it's labeled libertarian socialist, sometimes it's labeled like there's all kinds of goofy labels. I mean, that's why like some of these things I kind of take it all with a grain of salt. We just kind of use them as like launching off points, I feel like. Yeah. But I think that as far as like where the United States could go, I'm all about worker co-ops, and I'm also all about the idea of, we have been brainwashed, and not just in the United States, in other parts of the world too. We have been brainwashed that this idea of innovating and wanting to contribute to the world is associated somehow with capitalism, which is not just misleading, it's a freaking lie. I think it's a 100%. Straight up lie. I think that's actually the human condition. You want to educate people. You have ideas. You want to spread those ideas. So you write things. I love to be creative. So I ended up being a comedian. And I love to do that. I would have done that, or hopefully would have done that wherever I was born, right? I mean, unless I was born into a situation where my basic needs were not met, if I didn't have enough food to eat or something like that, you know? So I think that allowing a system where people can still, you know, if somebody wants to start a Thai restaurant in their community, they can do that. I'm for those types of things. I'm not against that. What I think should happen, though, is that it should be orchestrated and kind of managed via public resources. There should be public banks that that fund all of these things, and we, the community, should help foster all of that, and we should kind of put things back into it. So if you want to start something, you're not going to go bankrupt trying to do it. You're also not going to have to deal with all these middlemen, landlords, and stuff like that. Instead, it's all public resources, and it's all, everybody kind of has resources at their disposal, and you know, and they kind of flourish that way. To me, that's like the most realistic, like where we could potentially go next. And I think that is loosely market socialism. Now, there's a few areas where I differ from that body of ideas. I'm in principle against the idea of private property. I feel like this whole, everything I just described would function better if private property were not a thing, because then again, it would all be publicly owned. It would all be utilities that everybody would have access to then, you know, build something and then have a worker co-op model. So, you know, again, it's not like I'm like by the T market socialist. I'm just saying like that's kind of the nucleus of it. And then there's another like ideas I have that kind of factor in with all of it, while also coping with the reality that some of the changes I'm talking about are likely not going to be changes I see in my lifetime.
Well, hopefully if there are those changes, or the changes that I would be advocating for would be a kind of more revolutionary restructuring of the economy, along the lines of like what has happened in Cuba and elsewhere. But hopefully we will see some version of one of those reconfigurations in our lifetime.
I hope so.
Or at least I think that it's definitely worth struggling for, because the clock is ticking too, right? It's not like the planet is getting better. It's also not like the global economic situation is getting better, right? There's more socioeconomic inequality in the world today than ever in the history of humanity, and that's being driven by the capitalist system. And every sign now is that it's just getting worse. And so I do think that like models, what I really like about what you said, though, just to like pick on one point that where there's complete and utter agreement, is one thing that happens in a capitalist system is the creative labor power that we have, like the ability to do fun and interesting shit and not be tapped into or kind of have our existence defined for us by our vocation. Because most people have to work some shitty job, and so the hours of the day when they are the most vigilant and conscious, they're doing some paperwork or driving Uber or some other things. And to have a world in which our creative labor power would have the opportunity to express itself rather than just be a kind of cog in the capitalist system, like there, I think there's perfect and utter agreement. And I think that there's a great documentary film that's available on Vimeo if people want to watch it, called Cubanas. And it's just about the women of the Cuban Revolution. And it's one of the most interesting things is the number of women they interview who say, the greatest thing about the Cuban Revolution is the fact that I've been able to change my life over and over again. At first, I was a violin teacher. Then I became a dancer. Now I'm teaching in high school. And the Cuban system allows me to do that because I'm not just a cog in a capitalist system, but instead I'm contributing to a social project. And that social project recognizes that I have creative labor power, and that I might not want to express that in only one way that works for the capitalist system for like 40 years, and then they'll put me out to pasture. or whatever. And so the relationship between the socioeconomic system and individual life is really important in that regard, as most people who like do volunteer work or do things that they're passionate about really understand, right? If you're doing some mutual aid or volunteering at a bookstore that's like an alternative bookstore or something like that, sometimes actually work can be enjoyable,
Right.
and that's how it should be.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I think like that is one area where, I mean, I think it goes without saying, even the United States has that completely backwards.
Yeah.
We have it completely backwards. Our work culture is, I think calling it toxic is an understatement. Whatever, I can't even think of a word right now for what it is. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like it does not have to be that way. We can have a society where, yeah, the people who want to grow food can do it, and the people who want to be creative can do it. And it doesn't have to just, it does produce value to a society, to a populace. It just has to be kind of put in the right place. And capitalism prohibits that sort of thing from happening for the most part. I mean, it's like all the beautiful things that we do have in the United States and elsewhere, it's all in spite of capitalism, not because of it.
Yeah. Well, because capitalism tries to tap into people's creative labor power and use it for profit. And so you have, brilliant people who could be artists and musicians and other things, and they're working for the ad industry or they're working for PR firms. And that's because the way the capitalist system is set up is it's, again, referencing Michael Parenti here. He has a great line. He says that reality is radical. And what he means by that is, like, the ruling class has a problem on their hands because the baseline of everybody's existence is that life under capitalism is pretty damn shitty. People are working jobs, if they can even find them, that they don't like. They're having problems with healthcare. They could go bankrupt overnight because they have a health problem. They can't find secure housing. Like, the problems just go on and on and on. And so capitalism has a real problem on its hands. How does it hide the fact that reality is radical, that reality makes people radicals because they get pissed off at their bosses? They don't want to lose their life savings because they have one injury. And what capitalism does to solve that problem is they hire the creative labor power of, the so-called best and the brightest to make up false stories about how great capitalism is and how, and there are different ways of doing this. It can either be how great capitalism is, or they just create these illusory worlds that people can go into in order to unplug. And so they plug into the culture industry, they binge on Netflix, they watch a bunch of crap, and they forget about the mundane, exploited existence that they have. And then they can kind of go back to it the next day, knowing that, well, at the end of the day, at least I'll be able to binge on Netflix again. It's a pretty sorry existence. It depletes people of, some people criticize Marx for being a humanist and for believing in the creativity of human beings as makers of worlds who can make sense of the world and create new things. But I think there's a lot of value in thinking about us as homo faber, as makers of worlds, and that as makers of worlds, we're creative. And that creativity, it's either crushed in us or it's siphoned off so that we're creative for the ad industry or the marketing industry or other such things, or working out in Hollywood. It's like, ugh, that would be a shitty existence for anybody in film, right?
No
Having
idea
to
what
make
you're
a film that would conform to Hollywood parameters.
I was walking around. This was a little while ago. I think this was over the summer, so it was a hot minute ago, but it was like during the pandemic, obviously. And I saw a bunch of tents around, and I kind of thought, oh, that's so cool. They organized a community thing to feed people. That's so good. I'm so happy to see that. And I'm feeling good about my neighborhood. And I got a little closer. It was a film set.
Oh, no shit.
And I was like, for a second, I forgot what town I'm in.
Was the film set, was it outsourcing its extras? Did they just go to a homeless encampment or something and like film it so they didn't have to pay for the extras to
who knows? Maybe. Who knows? I don't know. But I got a little closer and I saw that it was just like one of those like craft services tent, like the tent. And I was like, oh, okay, and people actually had to pay for what they were getting too. So I guess it wasn't even. I saw the exchange of money, so I'm assuming they had to pay for the food. But yeah, there you go. It's kind of one of those moment of hope taken away really quick.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your